Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. And this seems to be the perfect time for us to have a conversation all about caregiving. Now, those of you who have been listening to the podcast already know that after my wife Jean was diagnosed with secondary progressive MS, I spent about a decade as her caregiver. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about that experience, you can visit our website at realtalkms.com and click on the About RealTalk MS page. Or you can hear it firsthand by checking out episode 1 of the podcast, where I kind of walk you through Jean's story and my story and why I think this podcast is so important. Speaking of important things, before we get to that conversation about caregiving, we have another important matter to discuss: your taxes. Right now, the United States Congress is considering 2 different bills that will rewrite our income tax laws. One of these bills is in the House of Representatives, and one of them is in the Senate. And while they're both different bills, each of them poses a serious financial threat to families who are living with MS or really any other chronic illness. So I think it's important that we take a couple of minutes and kind of focus on where the danger is in each of these bills and talk about what you might be able to do about it. So let's start with the bill in the House, which actually has already been passed by the House of Representatives. This bill eliminates the deduction that people take for medical expenses. And this is a critically important deduction for families who are dealing with chronic illness, who require very expensive prescription medication, all of which may not be covered by their current insurance plan, or they may require specialized high-cost procedures, specialized high-cost treatments that aren't fully covered by their insurance, and so they have personal expenses. As the law currently stands, they can deduct those expenses from their taxes. Under the proposed bill that's been passed by the House, that deduction goes away. And when that deduction goes away, their financial exposure, their liability, can go up dramatically. And this all by itself has the potential to be financially devastating to anyone who's dealing with progressive MS or really any chronic illness that requires significant treatment. Now, the bill in the Senate is a little different than the one in the House. To begin with, the bill in the Senate hasn't been voted on yet, so it hasn't passed the Senate. It's still being discussed. It's still being changed. So there's an opportunity to influence what that bill looks like. But as it stands today, the Senate tax bill preserves the deduction for medical expenses, but it eliminates the requirement for mandatory insurance coverage under the Affordable Care Act. Now, you may be wondering, what does the Affordable Care Act have to do with our income taxes? And I'm not going to begin to answer that because it's a whole separate conversation. But I do want to talk about why this change represents a serious threat to families living with MS. And to understand that, you kind of have to understand how insurance works. So insurance companies go out and sell their insurance policies, and they sell them to people who are both healthy and not so healthy. That's why that mandatory coverage requirement is so important. So that when they look at their pool of people that they're insuring, they know they have a mix of people who will require treatment for various illnesses and people who are younger, healthier, have no illness, and therefore won't be a financial burden to the insurance company. So they collect premiums from everyone, And part of those premiums go to pay for treatment for people who need it. But it's always offset by the people who don't need it or won't need it as much. Now, the reason that pool works is because everyone is required to have health insurance. When you remove the mandatory requirement, people who are healthy may decide they don't need health insurance. People who are younger and healthier especially may say to themselves, I may need this later in life, but I don't need it today. So they drop their insurance coverage. And when they do that, the only people left in the pool are the people who need treatment, the people who are not quite so healthy. And insurance companies don't like that level of risk. There's nowhere for them to offset or spread their financial risk. So they choose one of two paths. Now, sometimes an insurance company will simply say, I don't like how this pool of insured people looks, so I simply will not offer health insurance to them. Now, does that happen in real life? It happens all the time. It happened to me this year when Anthem Blue Cross, one of the largest health insurance companies in the country, advised everyone in Southern California that if you purchase your policy on your state exchange as part of the Affordable Care Act, they will no longer be offering you a policy. So they basically shook my hand and said, go out there into the marketplace and we hope you find other coverage. So that's one choice that they make all the time. Now, the other choice they make is they say, well, we're going to continue offering health insurance, but because the pool looks a little bit different now, because there aren't healthy people or as many healthy people in it as there used to be when it was mandatory, we have to protect ourselves. We have to figure out another way to spread the risk. And what we're going to do is we're going to raise everybody's premium. So we will simply take in more money from the people who need to be covered so that our risk, our financial liability is protected. Does that happen? Well, it happened every day up until the Affordable Care Act made it mandatory for everybody to get insurance, and so the pool looked a lot better. Either of these outcomes is a negative one, because if you're dealing with multiple sclerosis, you can't afford not to have insurance, but it could get so expensive that you can't afford to have it. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office has indicated that at the end of 10 years, 13 million Americans who have health insurance today will no longer be insured. And the ones who are insured are going to be paying more for their health insurance than they do now. So your health insurance either becomes unaffordable or unavailable. These are all pretty negative choices. Now, we have one bill in the House and one bill in the Senate. How does that all work out? If you remember how a bill becomes a law, think back to that episode of Schoolhouse Rock that we're all so familiar with. You know that the House bill and the bill that's passed by the Senate gets sent to what's called a conference committee. And these are members of the House and members of the Senate who sit down and create a third bill that's kind of a compromise between the other two. So it'll preserve some things from the House bill. It'll preserve some things from the Senate bill. It'll change some other things so that at the end of the day, there is one bill that looks pretty good to the people on that committee to take back to the members of the House and to take back to the members of the Senate. Both houses of Congress vote on the compromise bill, and when it passes, it becomes law. So what sort of potential outcome are we looking at for this particular bill when it finally becomes law? As things stand now, there are three potential outcomes. One is that the final bill in final form eliminates the deduction for out-of-pocket medical expenses. And this in itself can be financially devastating to families living with MS. Now, the second possible outcome is that that deduction is maintained, but what is lost is the mandatory requirement that people carry health insurance under the Affordable Care Act. And when that happens, health insurance becomes unaffordable and perhaps even unavailable. And that creates a whole crisis for families living with MS. Now, there's a third potential outcome here as well. And I guess we can call that the worst of all possible worlds. We could end up with an income tax law that eliminates the deduction for medical expense and eliminates the requirement for mandatory health care coverage under the ACA. So we have financial devastation. We have a public health crisis where 13 million Americans will lose their health care coverage, and the rest of us will pay more for it. How much more? We don't even know. So I personally find all of these outcomes unacceptable, and I hope you do too. But this isn't merely an exercise in preaching doom and gloom. I said there was something that we could probably do about this, and one of the things we can do is at least make our opinions known to our lawmakers. You've heard me in other podcasts talk about the importance of being an activist when you're part of the MS community, because this kind of legislation hurts us in a serious way. So there is something you can do, and that is pick up the phone and call your senator. The Congressional Switchboard telephone number is area code 202-224-3121. When you call the switchboard, ask for either of your two senators, and perhaps you want to make two calls so you reach both of them, and let them know that you're a constituent, that you're someone who's living with multiple sclerosis, and explain what these new proposed policies will do to you and your family. You know, in our second podcast episode, my guest was Donna Edwards, who's a former member of Congress who's been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And she talked about how important these phone calls can be and how they can be absolutely critical in helping shape the way our legislators are going to vote on a particular issue. So please take a moment and speak up for yourselves and for your loved ones, and make sure your elected officials understand that we can't afford to lose the deduction for medical expenses, and we certainly can't afford a healthcare system that does away with the mandatory requirements, because that puts people who are not 100% healthy at much, much greater risk. And I apologize for carrying on this long about this issue, but it's an important one. And if you do go back and listen to podcast episode number 1, you'll know that part of my intention is to make each of you an MS activist, to stand up and use your voice and take advantage of the fact that there is strength in numbers in influencing public policy so that it does not victimize families living with multiple sclerosis. In a moment, we're going to get into our discussion about what it takes to be a world-class caregiver. I've always said that caregiver is the one job that no one ever plans to apply for. As my wife Jean unexpectedly found herself walking the path of someone with a particularly aggressive case of multiple sclerosis, I unexpectedly found myself walking the path of a family caregiver. And my role as Jean's caregiver progressed down what I later learned was a fairly typical path of denial, stress, depression, and finally, understanding. I think I learned how to do things right by initially doing most of them wrong. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, I found that I actually had plenty of time to make those mistakes and then learn from them. And I also took the things that I had learned and shared them with other caregivers. So I had the opportunity to interact with a lot of family caregivers, and I saw firsthand that the caregiver's journey is the one aspect of chronic illness that can most easily be overlooked. It doesn't always get paid the proper amount of attention, until the moment that a family caregiver finds themselves feeling isolated, overwhelmed, drained, and depressed. But it doesn't have to come to that. And that's why we're talking about caregiving today. And it's an important subject for an awful lot of people. AARP has done a tremendous job kind of surveying the landscape of caregiving in America. And they've discovered that there are over 40 million family caregivers. And if you took the financial value of all of the unpaid caregiver services that those people provide to their loved ones, it's estimated to be more than $470 billion a year. The folks at EMD Serrano, the pharmaceutical company which manufactures Rebif as well as many other non-MS drugs, they've also done a survey of unpaid family caregivers. And what they found is that nearly half of them indicate they have feelings of depression. Nearly half of them feel that their physical health has suffered as a result of their caregiver duties. Nearly half of them feel that they don't have time to book or attend medical appointments for themselves. Now, if you heard the podcast last week, you might remember that my guest was Dr. Amy Sullivan from the Cleveland Clinic. And one of the things we were talking about was depression, not only among people with MS, but among their caregivers as well. And Dr. Sullivan reminded me of that sage advice that we always receive from our flight attendants before we take off. In the event of a loss of cabin pressure, oxygen masks will deploy from the ceiling. If you're traveling with someone who needs assistance, put on your own oxygen mask and then help them with theirs. This is not only good advice on takeoff, this is great advice for caregivers everywhere. When we forget to care for the caregiver, we risk being able to provide care down the road for our loved one. So it's a really important and simple lesson to keep in mind. And there are other things that you can do. As I met lots of family caregivers, I came to recognize 3 characteristics that great caregivers all seem to have in common. The first thing I noticed was that great caregivers lead with love. You know, there are a few roles in life that are more demanding than being a caregiver for a loved one who may be dealing with chronic illness. The stress and emotional strain can sometimes become unbearable, and those are the times when all of those logical, rational, well-thought-out reasons for being a caregiver fly right out the window. But as they say, love endures. When a caregiver leads with love, they never wonder why. They always know exactly why they're doing what they're doing, and any commitment that's backed up by unconditional love becomes the easiest commitment to keep. Caring for someone suffering with a chronic illness can even change the nature of your relationship with them. Over time, it may become far less of a partnership than it once was. Your loved one may lose the capacity to emotionally express themselves, or they may act out in ways that cause you to feel frustrated and even angry with them. That's why sometimes getting in touch with your unconditional love for that person becomes a matter of looking inside yourself, because caregiving is really all about who you are. It's really not about the person you're caring for. And there will be times when all you really have to fuel your love and commitment toward another who needs your help is the inner sense that it's the right thing to do because that's who you are. Another characteristic I saw was that great caregivers learn to connect with others. And now there are some people who just get this right away. Others need to learn it, but no one succeeds at much of anything in life on their own. And that's especially true when it comes to being a caregiver. Becoming a great caregiver requires that you learn to ask for and accept help with grace. It requires that you proactively build a social network that can serve as your safety net. It forces you to keep in mind that you're never alone, no matter how isolated you may feel at any particular moment. And I know that when caregivers look around, they don't always see the social network that's ready to serve as their safety net, but people who care about you are everywhere. They're in your church, or your synagogue, or your mosque. They're at events sponsored by the MS Society. Members of your social network are probably literally right next door. So the next time that you accompany your loved one to a medical appointment, ask their doctor about caregiver support groups. People who are ready to connect with you and support you are everywhere. And thanks to tools like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, it's never been easier to connect with others. So start connecting today and build that network. Great caregivers remember to take care of the caregiver. Caregiver burnout is all too frequent, and that's why it's so important for caregivers to take the time to take care of themselves, to give themselves an afternoon or an evening off, to treat themselves to that special meal or outing, to invite friends and family into their homes, to do everything possible to offset some of the stress and strain that they may face on a daily basis. Because if the caregiver fails to take care of themselves, then eventually there are two problems to solve. The caregiver now needs to be cared for, as does their loved one. And it really strikes me that anytime we're talking about caregiver practices, we seem to be skirting around or sometimes addressing directly issues of emotional burnout, caregiver depression. And I think it's understandable and not at all as scary as it may sound. Because the fact of the matter is there are times when, as a caregiver, you're likely going to feel overwhelmed. You're likely going to be in high stress situations. So it's natural that you feel that way. And I think that rather than trying to create a life that avoids those high stress moments, because let's face it, by definition, most of those high stress moments are beyond your control, what we can do instead is look for ways to offset and manage those moments of high stress. There are things you can absolutely do for yourself that will help you fight that depression, fight that feeling of being overwhelmed. Simple things like exercise. Physical exercise releases those depression-fighting endorphins. And it also helps to lessen your fatigue, which, as a caregiver, you know all about. So exercise is first on the list. You can also take advantage of other stress management techniques like meditation or yoga or even guided imagery. These are all effective tools. Just talking about your feelings with a close friend or family member or a spiritual counselor can be a great way to diffuse an emotional situation that may be taking place. And another suggestion, find a caregiver support group either online or in your community, because there you can connect with other caregivers who are facing many of the same issues that you're probably facing. And in a group like that, you're not only going to be heard, but you're going to be understood, and that gives you a tremendous release. Other group activities, just having to show up to a group can motivate you, and that motivation is going to make you feel better. And then there's other added benefits. People in that group may become part of your social network, as we talked about earlier. There are just so many tools available to help fight caregiver burnout or caregiver depression, whether it's pursuing a spiritual interest or maybe volunteering for an organization or a cause that can benefit from your help. Even something like getting a pet, experiencing a pet's unconditional love is a great way to immediately start feeling better no matter how your day is going. Or you may want to decide to keep a gratitude journal. And that's simple. You just start each day by writing down the things in life that you're most grateful for. Reminding yourself that the glass is half full is a great way to start the day, and it's going to improve your outlook. Or just find ways to laugh. It's been shown that laughing and even smiling actually have real therapeutic value. And by the way, they don't require a prescription, so you can start doing that today. So whether it's exercising more than you used to, whether it's meditating, talking about your feelings with a friend, or even learning to laugh a little more frequently, there are just any number of things that a caregiver can do that can absolutely change your disposition, change your outlook, change your perspective, all for the better. If there's one other thing that I've noticed great caregivers know how to do, is they know how to ask for help. Because as a caregiver, you hear someone say, if there's anything I can do to help, probably more times than you can count. But what happens next? What is your response to that very generous offer? Too often, there's no response or a terribly non-specific response. And if nothing's been agreed to, well, then nothing's going to happen. So the next time someone asks if there's anything they can do to help, respond specifically. Is there anything I can do to help? Well, yes, and thanks so much for offering. I have an appointment this Thursday afternoon at 2:00, and it would really be great if you could come by the house and stay with John for about 2 hours. Does that work for you? Now, when you put it like that, there's very little doubt about what kind of help you can use and what kind of help you're probably going to receive. So the easiest way to do this for a lot of people is simply to make a list of tasks that friends can help you with. And these may not be things specifically related to your caregiving responsibilities. You may not need someone to come by and help give someone medication. Maybe the biggest thing someone can do to help you today is pick up a gallon of milk at the supermarket because it's difficult for you to get out of the house today. So put that task on your list. Keep that list handy. And anytime a friend or a neighbor asks if they can be helpful, look at your list and assign them one of the tasks you've written down. Because in caregiving, as in the rest of life, nobody makes it alone. There are just so many things we can keep talking about when it comes to the best practices for caregivers. So this is a subject we're going to come back to in future podcast episodes. I think this is a good time to wrap things up now. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.